On the 27th of October, 1838, the governor of an American state signed an order. It told his soldiers that an entire religious community, men, women, and children, had to be exterminated or driven out of the state. That word, exterminated, isn't me summarizing. It's right there in the document. And it sat on Missouri's books for the next 138 years. 8 years before that signature, these same people had been selling their farms and gathering to one spot to build what they called Zion, a literal city of God out on the American frontier. So tonight I'm walking you from those farm sales to that signature, because what they tried to build and why it nearly destroyed them, that's the whole story of Part 3. If you're just getting here, welcome. The ground you need is only 2 sentences long. In Part 1, a farm boy named Joseph Smith said God spoke to him in a grove of trees in New York back in 1820. In Part 2, he produced a book he said came off buried golden plates, the Book of Mormon, printed in 1830, with 11 signed witnesses who went to their graves refusing to take it back. That's all you need to follow along tonight, though both parts are sitting there for you when you want the full walk. This is Part 3 of 5, and my promise hasn't moved since the first episode. I'll take the question seriously, I'll treat every side of it fairly, and I'll stay faithful without getting loud about it. Tonight that promise earns its keep, because this is the chapter where nobody's hands stay clean, including some hands this channel loves. Before we cross into Ohio, give me one honest minute. This channel's young, and it's here to tell this faith's story the way it actually happened. Hard parts and all, and to carry the word of the restoration to people who never got the real version. A like and a subscribe do real work for a small channel that's still finding its feet. And do me a favor, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, because I read every single one. So here's the road tonight. We start with the word Zion, because nothing in this episode makes sense until you know what these people meant by it. Then a city rising in Ohio, and a temple built out of flat poverty. Then a bank. And I'm going to tell you that one straight because it's the most sensationalized thing in this whole period. Then Missouri, where it all slides, one step at a time, into a real shooting war, a massacre, and that order. And before we're done, I'm going to put the hardest question on the table myself, whether Joseph's people brought this on themselves, and I'll argue it properly, both sides. One warning before we go, because it names the real enemy of tonight. Almost every version of this period flattens it. In one, the believers are spotless victims, and Missouri is pure evil. In the other, a fraud finally gets what's coming to him, and his followers had it coming too. Hold that line all night, because it's the spine of everything I'm about to show you. The flattened version is always the false version. Start with the word itself, Zion, because to these people it was never a metaphor, and that one fact drives everything that comes next. When Joseph Smith and his early followers said Zion, they meant a place with an address, a real city gathered out of a scattered world where believers would live with one heart, hold their property in common, and, in the words of a revelation Joseph had already dictated about the ancient city of Enoch, have no poor among them. And these people, by the way, called themselves Latter-day Saints. The Saints, for short. That's the name they answered to, so that's the name I'll use tonight. New converts weren't just asked to believe, they were asked to come. Sell the farm, load the wagon, and gather. In the winter of 1830 to 31, just months after the church was organized, a revelation pointed the whole young movement west, to Ohio, and the gathering place turned out to be a little township on the Chagrin River called Kirtland. And there, in February of 1831, Joseph dictated the law of consecration. And this is the engine of everything money-related tonight. A member deeded his property over to the church's bishop, got back what his family needed to live on, that was his stewardship, and gave whatever was left over to the poor. In practice, it ran unevenly, and it buckled under poverty almost right away. But keep the ideal in front of you. These were people trying in dead earnest to build an economy where nobody went without. Then the map doubled. In the summer of 1831, Joseph traveled 900 miles, all the way to the far western edge of the United States, the Missouri frontier. And out there he dictated the revelation his people would stake everything on. It's section 57 in the Doctrine and Covenants, which is the book of his collected revelations, and it named a town, Independence, in Jackson County, Missouri. That was the center place of Zion. Not a Zion someday, somewhere. That county, that courthouse, that ground. So from 1831 on, this movement had two poles, nearly 900 miles apart, a headquarters in Ohio and a promised city in Missouri, and converts poured toward both. By the summer of 1833, around 1,200 saints had gathered into Jackson County, and their neighbors had watched them show up with growing alarm. So put yourself on the other porch for a second. These newcomers were mostly Yankees from New England and New York, dropped into a rough southern frontier county. They voted together, they traded with each other, they bought up land in blocks, and they openly taught that God had promised them the whole region. Then, in July of 1833, their newspaper ran a careful little article about free black converts, and the neighbors in a slave state read that as an invitation to abolition. None of that excuses what came next, but it does explain the fear sitting underneath it. What came next landed on the 20th of July, 1833. A mob, several hundred strong, gathered at Independence, tore down the Saints' printing office, threw the press out into the street, and scattered the loose, unbound pages of the Book of Revelations it had been printing. There's a 15-year-old girl in this, Mary Elizabeth Rollins, and she told a story later, how she and her little sister ran into a cornfield with their arms full of those pages while men hunted for them. That same afternoon, the mob grabbed Bishop Edward Partridge, the man who ran the whole consecration system, hauled him to the public square, and tarred and feathered him. By November, the entire community, better than 1,000 people, got driven across the Missouri River into Clay County in the early winter, their homes burning behind them. And hang on to this next detail, because the last act of tonight turns on it. Nobody was ever convicted for any of it. Nobody was ever paid a cent, even though the saints petitioned the courts, the governor, and the President of the United States. The next spring, Joseph marched a relief expedition called Zion's Camp, about 200 volunteers, 900 miles from Ohio to Missouri, to put his people back on their land. It restored nothing. Cholera tore through the camp, more than a dozen died, and the whole thing turned around and went home. A critic looks at Zion's Camp and sees a fiasco led by a failed prophet. A believer looks at it and notices that most of the men who'd lead this church for the next 50 years were forged on that march. Both of them are staring at the same road. So mark the score at 1834. The first run at Zion ended with the press in the street, the bishop tarred on the square, and the people exiled inside their own country. And their answer wasn't to give up on the city. Their answer was to build the temple first. Because while Missouri smoldered, Kirtland was rising. And what those people put up there out of almost nothing outlasts everything else in tonight's story. From 1833 to 1836, a community of a few hundred families, most of them dirt poor, built a temple in Kirtland that ran them about $40,000, a staggering number for people who often didn't own shoes. The men quarried sandstone and worked shifts on the walls between planting seasons. The women spun and wove and boarded the workers. They mixed crushed glass and broken crockery into the outer plaster so the walls would glitter in the sun, and you can still see that sparkle on it today. Now there's a beloved story that the women gave up their best china for that plaster. And I'll be straight with you. Historians think that one grew in the retelling, but the glitter itself is real. And I'd rather hand you a true sparkle than a polished legend. That trade is the whole spirit of this series. On the 27th of March, 1836, they dedicated it. Close to 1,000 people packed into the hall, and hundreds more turned away at the doors. The week after is remembered among the saints as a kind of American Pentecost, days of visions and prophesying. And on the 3rd of April, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, the scribe you met back in part 2, recorded that the Savior himself appeared to them in that temple, and then Moses, Elias, and Elijah, and handed them sacred keys of authority. You'll find that as section 110. Now, whatever you personally make of the visions, just stand in the spring of 1836 and look around you. 7 years into this unlikely story, the believers had a city rising, a temple dedicated, and missionaries heading out in every direction. It had never once looked more like the whole thing was going to work. And within about 18 months, Joseph Smith would ride out of that temple town at midnight, at a gallop, and never see it again. So what happened? One word, and I want to say it carefully, because more nonsense gets talked about this one word than almost anything else in his whole life. A bank. First, the setting, and for this I'm leaning on the historian Mark Staker, whose book, Hearken, O Ye People, is the deepest study anybody's written of Kirtland's economy. Kirtland in 1836 was bursting. The gathering had multiplied the town several times over in 5 years. Land prices were shooting up, and the community was land rich and cash poor, because converts kept arriving with wagons and faith and almost no money. Now in that era, before there was any national currency, the normal American fix was local. A town would charter a bank, the bank printed its own paper notes, and those notes became the money of the region, redeemable at the counter for gold or silver coin, which the law called specie. Hundreds of American towns did exactly this. So in November of 1836, church leaders organized the Kirtland Safety Society, with Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith as its main officers. And they sent off to the Ohio legislature for a charter, which was the legal license every bank needed. The legislature said no. It said no to most bank applications that winter. And here the leaders made the fateful call. On legal advice, in January of 1837, they reorganized as the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company, a joint stock company that would issue notes without a charter. Say that name again and you can hear the lawyers sweating. It was a bank in everything but the license. It struggled from the very first week. It was undercapitalized because subscribers had pledged land, not coin, and the notes ran straight into a wall of hostility. Inside about a month, it had to stop redeeming notes in specie at all. And its enemies moved fast. In February, a man named Samuel Rounds filed suits under an old Ohio banking statute against Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and the other officers. But Rounds was a straw man. The record shows he was really acting for Grandison Newell, a local businessman who'd turned hounding Joseph Smith into something close to a personal hobby, and who reportedly paid Rounds $100 to bring the cases. Then in May came the blow nobody in Kirtland had any control over. The Panic of 1837, one of the worst financial collapses in American history, rolled out of New York as the big banks suspended specie payments, and banks went under by the hundreds across the country. A tiny, unchartered, underfunded frontier bank never stood a chance in that storm. And it had real rot on the inside, too. Joseph resigned that summer and backed away from it. The officers who kept it going, his former clerk Warren Parrish among them, ran the note press hard. Accusations of misconduct flew both directions, and none of it was ever settled in court. In October, Smith and Rigdon were each fined $1,000 under that banking statute, and by November, the Safety Society was dead. So let's weigh it honestly, because two flattened versions of this bank are floating around, and neither one survives the record. The sensational version says a false prophet printed worthless paper, fleeced his own flock, and skipped town with the cash. But look at what that version has to hide. Joseph Smith bought into the society heavily, and he lost his own money right along with everybody else. He stayed on the hook for Kirtland's debts, and he kept working to pay creditors for years after he'd left, which is not what a swindler does. And his bank died in the very same 12 months that killed hundreds of chartered, respectable, non-profit-led banks. Now the comfortable, faithful version has its own things to hide. Running a note-issuing company without a charter was against Ohio law. The fine said so. The project was reckless, launched on hope and land paper in the middle of a speculative bubble. And here's the part I most want to say out loud, because this is the part that actually hurt people. In Kirtland, faith and finance had gotten braided together. Members heard the bank talked about in the language of faith, so when the notes went to zero, it didn't feel like a business failing. It felt like a prophecy failing. Poor people lost everything, trusting that a prophet's project couldn't fall. But sincerity isn't solvency, and a prophet's title doesn't balance a ledger. So the honest verdict, and this is roughly where the careful historians land, is bad judgment in the worst possible year, with real victims and no proven fraud. Richard Bushman, whose biography Rough Stone Rolling is The Standard Scholarly Life of Joseph Smith, reads Kirtland pretty much this way: as the overreach of an inexperienced, overextended man, not the scheme of a thief. That verdict doesn't fully satisfy anybody, which is usually the sign of a true one. What it cost, nobody disputes. All through late 1837, Kirtland tore itself apart. Hundreds of members walked away, including men who'd sat in the church's highest councils. Dissenters and creditors circled, the meetings turned bitter, and the threats turned physical. But I want to hand you one strange grace note out of that same summer, because it complicates the collapse story in a way I find telling. In June of 1837, with the bank dying all around him, Joseph sent Heber C. Kimball, an apostle who'd been a potter by trade, to open the church's first mission overseas, in England. And inside about a year, the missionaries working the mill towns of the Ribble Valley had baptized some 2,000 English converts, which means the church was picking up members abroad faster than Kirtland could lose them at home. The town was failing. The faith was not. Then, on the night of the 12th of January, 1838, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon rode out of Kirtland in the dark, heading west, ahead of the lawsuits and, by their own account, armed men chasing them. The city of the temple was finished as a gathering place. Zion had exactly one address left, which brings us to Missouri, and the season where this story turns into a war. Watch how it builds, one decision at a time, because no single step looks like a war while somebody's taking it. Missouri, to its credit, had tried to solve its Mormon problem decently. Clay County had sheltered those Jackson refugees, but in 1836, it asked them to move along. So that December, the state legislature carved out a brand new county in the empty prairie up north, Caldwell County, with the understanding that it would be a Mormon homeland. The Saints built its county seat, a town called Far West, and by 1838, several thousand people were living there, with a temple site staked out on the square. When Joseph got there from Kirtland in March of 1838, he found the closest thing to a working Zion his people would ever have. And give that compromise its due, because it was a real one. But then watch it break from both ends. The gathering just kept growing, and Saints started settling well past Caldwell's lines. Up on a bluff above the Grand River in Daviess County to the north, which Joseph named Adam-on-Diamond, and identified by Revelation as the ground where Adam himself had once lived. And over at DeWitt in Carroll County to the east. To the Saints, this was buying land in America, which it was. But to the old settlers, who'd understood the deal as Mormons stay put in Caldwell, it looked like the whole bargain dissolving right in front of them, with enough votes to swallow county after county coming up close behind. And inside Far West, the mood hardened too. And I'm not going to soften this part. That spring, the church purged its own dissenters, including men you met back in Part 2. Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer, two of the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, were excommunicated at Far West and driven out of Caldwell County. In June, Sidney Rigdon preached what people remember as the Salt Sermon, painting the dissenters as salt that had lost its savor, fit to be cast out and trodden underfoot. And that same season, a secret society formed among the saints, the Danites, a private band of enforcers and pretty soon raiders, led by a man named Samson Avard. How much Joseph Smith actually knew and blessed is still argued among historians, and I'm going to leave it argued rather than pretend that it's settled. Then, on the 4th of July, 1838, at Far West, Rigdon gave a speech that ended on a vow that if the mobs ever rose against them again, the fight would become, and these are his exact words, a war of extermination. Hear that clearly. The word extermination walked into this story from a Latter-day Saint pulpit months before any governor sent it back. When I told you nobody's hands stay clean tonight, this is exactly what I meant. The match hit the powder on the 6th of August. At Gallatin, the county seat of Davis, a candidate named William Peniston climbed on a barrel on election day, called the Saints horse thieves and liars, and demanded they be kept from voting. A brawl broke out. Rumor blew it up into killings on both sides that had never actually happened, and armed bands started to ride. Through September and October, the spiral kept tightening. Vigilantes laid siege to the Saints at DeWitt until, starved out and flat ignored by the state, they abandoned the town that October. The appeals reached Governor Lilburn Boggs, and the answer that came back was basically a shrug. This was a quarrel between the Mormons and the mob, and they could fight it out. Now keep one fact about Boggs in your head here, because it explains a lot. The man was an independence man from Jackson County itself, and he'd been Missouri's lieutenant governor back in 1833, while the Saints were getting driven out of his own home county. So the man now weighing their appeals had watched the first expulsion happen and lifted no hand against it. And now we come to the part a faithful channel has to say plainly, because it happened. In mid-October, Mormon companies rode into Daviess County and burned and looted the settlements of Gallatin and Millport, driving Missouri families out of their homes into an early snowstorm. And that is not some anti-Mormon slander. The church's own Gospel Topics essay, the one titled Peace and Violence Among 19th Century Latter-day Saints, says exactly that in so many words. If the version of this history somebody handed you has no Mormon torches in it, then you were handed the flattened version, and the flattened version is always the false version. On the 25th of October, at Crooked River, a Mormon company under David W. Patton, one of the church's 12 apostles, attacked a stake militia unit that had grabbed 3 Mormon prisoners. The writers said afterward that they thought they were facing a mob, not the militia. And in that country, in that season, the line between the two really could blur. But a militia unit is what it was. 1 Missourian was killed. 3 Latter-day Saints died of their wounds, Patton among them. And the news that galloped to the governor's desk arrived swollen into a massacre of half the militia company. 2 days later, the governor answered. What came back from the governor was only a few lines long, and I want to read you the sentence at the center of it, exactly the way he signed it. On the 27th of October, 1838, Governor Lilburn W. Boggs issued the order that Missouri's own files record as Executive Order 44. He wrote to his militia commanders that the Mormons had to be treated as enemies and had to be exterminated or driven from the state if that's what the public peace required. And I'll be fair even here, because that's the promise. Boggs was acting on panicked blown-up reports of Crooked River. And in the 1830s, the word exterminate could mean to drive out completely, just as much as it could mean to destroy. Both readings were on the table, and the men out in the field were the ones who'd choose between them. 3 days later, on the 30th of October, more than 200 riders came down on a small mill settlement on Shoal Creek called Hawn's Mill. There's no proof the men who rode in that afternoon were even carrying the order. And for the people at that mill, the difference means nothing. The men and boys ran for the blacksmith shop, and its unchinked log walls turned it into a trap, because the attackers pushed their gun barrels through the gaps between the logs and fired into the crowded dark. 17 died. 14 men and 3 boys. An old man named Thomas McBride handed over his musket and was cut down with a corn cutter. A 10-year-old, Sardius Smith, was found hiding under the bellows and shot right where he crouched. And by the survivor's sworn account, his killer explained himself in 5 words: "I'm not going to dress up for you. Nits will make lice." The survivors, mostly women and children, lowered the bodies down into an unfinished well because they didn't dare stay long enough to dig 17 graves. I've read a lot of this period's record, and I still can't get through that page quickly. But one small light comes out of that darkness, and I want you to have it. Sardius's mother, Amanda Barnes Smith, lost her husband and that boy at the shop, and then she found her younger son, Alma, alive, with his hip shot clean away. Alone, with no doctor anywhere near, she prayed, and by her own account was directed step by step to clean the wound with lye and pack it with a poultice of slippery elm root. She nursed Alma flat on his face for 5 weeks, and the boy healed, walked, and lived to drive a wagon west and raise a family. She wrote the whole thing down herself, and it reads less like a grievance than a testimony. That's the kind of people this order came down on. At Far West, the end came within that same week. Thousands of state militia under Major General Samuel Lucas surrounded the town, and on the 1st of November it surrendered. The terms came down to confiscation and expulsion. The saints were disarmed, the town plundered, and over the next few days, men were forced to sign their property away at the point of a bayonet to cover the costs of the very war being waged against them. Joseph Smith and the other leaders were called into the militia camp under a flag of truce, and the second they arrived, they were seized. That night, a court-martial, thrown together on the spot, sentenced Joseph Smith and his companions to be shot at 9 the next morning on the public square of Far West in front of their own families. Lucas handed that order to Brigadier General Alexander Donovan, a Missourian, not a Latter-day Saint, a lawyer who'd represented the Saints back in better days. And Donovan's written answer deserves to be famous anywhere conscience gets taught. "It is cold-blooded murder," he wrote. "I will not obey your order." He promised to hold his own superior answerable before an earthly court, so help him God, and he marched his brigade away. Nobody was shot that morning. And it tells you something about this whole affair, that neither man was ever punished. Not the general who ordered the execution, and not the general who refused to carry it out. So Joseph got a dungeon instead of a firing squad. From the 1st of December, 1838, to the 6th of April, 1839, he and a handful of companions, his brother Hiram one of them, were held in the basement cell of the jail at Liberty, Missouri. A stone room, mostly underground, where the ceiling sat too low for a tall man to stand up straight. And while he sat in that hole through the coldest months of the year, his people were being driven out of Missouri under the order. Something like 8,000 to 10,000 human beings crossing the frozen state toward the Mississippi River. And the little town of Quincy, Illinois, about 1,600 people, took thousands of those destitute refugees into their homes that winter. Quincy's kindness ought to be remembered, at least as long as Boggs's order is. And out of that Liberty cell, that March, came a dictated letter that opens about as close to a broken heart as Joseph Smith ever sounds on paper, crying out, "O God, where art thou?" The saints later canonized parts of those prison letters. You can read them as sections 121 through 123, and the Joseph Smith Papers Project has published the originals. In April, the prisoners were moved for trial, and on the road, the guards, and by every appearance they did it on purpose, just let them ride away to Illinois. Missouri never did bring Joseph Smith to trial for the 1838 war, and the order itself outlived every single person in this story. It stayed on Missouri's books until the 25th of June, 1976, when Governor Christopher Bond formally rescinded it, writing that it had violated the Constitution and expressing, on behalf of all Missourians, deep regret for the suffering it caused. That leaves one question this episode still owes you, and I'd rather ask it myself than leave it sitting in the comments. Did the saints bring this on themselves? Let me build the yes case properly, because it's stronger than most faithful tellings will admit. These people showed up announcing that God had promised them the land. And if your farm happens to sit inside somebody else's promise, that isn't comforting doctrine. That's a threat with Scripture attached to it. They voted as a bloc big enough to tip whole counties. They broke out of the Caldwell Compromise inside 2 years of agreeing to it. In 1838, they organized a secret armed society, purged their own dissenters, listened to their top preacher promise a war of extermination in July, burned Gallatin and Millport in October, and attacked a state militia unit at Crooked River. But notice where the real weight of that list actually sits. The gathering, the doctrine, the block vote, even the alarming prophecies, all of that was legal. Because being frightening to your neighbors is not a crime in America. The raids and the battle, though, those were crimes. And that's where the serious version of the yes case plants its flag. The historian Stephen LeSueur, whose book, The 1838 Mormon War in Missouri, is the standard critical study, presses exactly this point, that Mormon aggression that autumn handed their enemies the pretext they'd been wanting for years. Put that way, the case has real weight, and a faithful viewer gains nothing by pretending it doesn't. Now weigh the other pan. The Jackson County expulsion happened in 1833, 5 years before a single Danite existed, before Rigdon ever said the word extermination out loud, before any Mormon raid or any militia battle. A mob destroyed the Saints' press, tarred their bishop, burned their homes, and drove 1,200 of them into the winter. And the provocation on the record adds up to this. The saints were cohesive, poor, growing, religiously strange, and suspected of abolitionism. The persecution comes before every single provocation the yes case can point to. And that ordering matters, because the saints' worst acts in 1838 came downstream of 5 years of learning that in Missouri the law would never once protect them. Now that context doesn't excuse Gallatin. Grievance is not a license, and I'm not going to hand it out as one. But then run the exact same rule the other direction, because Gallatin doesn't excuse Hawn's mill either, and no honest scale balances the two. When the smoke finally cleared, one side had 17 of its people in a well, its prophet in a dungeon, and thousands of its members stripped of everything they owned and expelled from an American state by executive order. No Missourian was driven anywhere. And Missouri itself, 138 years later, looked back at its own order and called it unconstitutional. Even the church's own essay admits the Mormon offenses. And even LeSueur's critical account doesn't make the saints the authors of that massacre. When the faithful record and the critical record each own up to the other side's half, the conclusion pretty much writes itself. The provocation ran both ways. The catastrophe ran one way. Flatten either half of that sentence, and you've traded history for a cartoon. And you know by now what I call the flattened version. So what did they actually build if the city failed twice? Here's the payoff of the whole night, and I think it's the quiet hinge of this entire series. Back in August of 1833, with Jackson County already burning, a revelation had quietly redefined the one word the whole project stood on. "This is Zion," it said, "the pure in heart." You'll find it in section 97. The city could be burned out of Missouri, but the people, it turned out, could not be burned out of being a people. They lost independence and stayed a people. They lost Kirtland and stayed a people. They walked out of Missouri in the snow, 10,000 strong, and got to Illinois still a people, carrying Zion with them, because by then it lived somewhere no executive order could ever reach. The temple their poverty built still stands in Kirtland today. And far west is just a quiet square of Missouri prairie now, with 4 temple cornerstones sitting in the grass. And I'll tell you, I've stood there myself on a windy afternoon, and the silence of that field does more arguing than I ever could. So tell me down in the comments, because I'll be reading. Have you ever been to Kirtland or far west? What did it feel like standing there? And then mark where this story goes next, because the refugees you just watched cross that ice are about to do the most improbable thing in the whole saga. Inside 5 years, they drain a malarial swamp on a bend of the Mississippi and raise one of the biggest cities in Illinois, with its own legion, its own university, and Joseph Smith at the height of his power, mayor, general, and prophet. And keep tonight's very first image in your back pocket: the printing press thrown out into the street at Independence. Because in part 4, a printing press gets destroyed again. Only this time, the order to destroy it comes from Joseph Smith. What that decision was, why he made it, and how it opened the road to a jail in Carthage, Illinois, that's part 4. Nauvoo, and power. I'm Nathan Reeves. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.